seconds. That military canine auction was supposed to be over in 2 hours. It ended with 30 combat dogs going completely silent at once, not from a trainer's signal, not from an electronic collar, but from a 28-year-old emergency nurse who walked into a room full of hardened contractors, spoke a single command in a voice that hadn't been heard inside that warehouse in 3 years. Dog. They called unadoptable, unreachable, dangerous, froze mid-lunge and dropped his head. Nobody in that room understood what they were seeing. The ones who did understand were the ones who had served beside a Navy SEAL medic named Daniel Whitmore, and every single one of them went quiet for a very different reason. If this story is hitting you already, stay with me until the very end, because what happens in the next 5 parts will change how you see loyalty, sacrifice, and the people we leave behind. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. 5. The drive from Porterfield took 4 hours on a 2-lane road that cut through scrubland and dying cattle country. And Maya Whitmore made it alone. Her old loaded with nothing but a thermos of gas station coffee, a manila folder. She'd read so many times the edges had gone soft, and a photograph tucked into the sun visor above the driver's seat. The photograph was not framed. It had never been framed. Trent slightly faded, showing a man in desert-pattern fatigues, kneeling beside a Belgian Malinois with a scarred ear and a working dog harness still buckled across his chest. The man's face was partially turned away from the camera, but Maya knew every detail of it without needing to see it straight on. She had memorized her father the way you memorize something you know you can't keep. She reached the auction site at 9:30 in the morning, 20 minutes before registration closed. Ridge Tactical sat east of the highway on 40 acres of flat, sun-baked property surrounded by chain link and razor wire, the kind of place that looked like it was built to hold something in rather than keep anything out. The main building was a converted agricultural warehouse with fresh gray paint over the original green corrugated metal. Parking lot was already full black SUVs and commercial vans bearing the logos of security companies she recognized from contract news cycles, private protection firms, and at least 3 vehicles with no markings at all, which told her more than the logos did. She parked at the far end of the lot between a diesel pickup with a company plate and an unmarked cargo van. For a moment she just sat there, engine ticking, as it cooled, both hands still on the wheel. "Okay," she said aloud. To nobody she grabbed the folder. K9s. She got out. The registration table was staffed by a woman with a platinum badge, and the efficient manner of someone who had processed 1,000 events just like this one. She barely looked at Maya when Maya approached bidder registration. Yes, company name or individual. Got a look, brief clinical, filing Maya into a category before she'd finished speaking. Paddle deposit is 5 refunded at end of auction if you don't win. Auto ID. Maya put her license on the table. The woman typed something, then slid a numbered paddle across the laminated surface. She said it like it meant nothing, and to her it probably didn't. Inside, the warehouse had been reconfigured into auction staging, rows of metal folding chairs facing a raised platform at the far end with temporary fencing along the sides, where holding pens held the dogs scheduled for the day's lots. Maya could smell them before she could see them clearly. That distinctive combination of kenneled animal and the specific chemical trace of anxiety that she associated, for reasons she couldn't fully articulate, like the ER intake area at Seaside General, where she'd spent the last 4 years triaging traumas at 2 a.m. She found a seat near the middle of the 3rd row. She didn't want to be too close to the front, didn't want to draw attention before the lot she'd come for, but she wasn't going to hide in the back either. The man to her left was in a pressed tactical shirt with a company logo she recognized: Ironwell Solutions, private security, federal contracts in 3 states. He glanced at her once, then twice, then turned fully forward and didn't look at her again. To her right had a clipboard and was annotating her own printed lot list with a red pen. Maya opened her folder and studied the single page she'd been looking at for 6 weeks. 24. Carlson Ranger, Belgian Malinois, 7 years. Itard K9 military working dog, JSOC attached unit. Documented handler. Attrition: 3 handlers in 18 months post-primary partner loss. Behavioral assessment. Level 4 reactive. Not recommended for civilian placement. Reserve bid. 2,500 level 4 reactive. She'd read that a dozen times. It was the auction company's polite language for a dog that had bitten 2 handlers and put a 3rd one through a chain-link fence. Every professional in this room had read the same file and made the same calculation: Ranger was a liability. With a broken safety, something you either put down or used in a controlled environment and replaced it when the risk outweighed the utility. a single one of them, had read the part of his service record that she had tracked down through a retired JAG officer who owed her father favor. Ranger had been issued to Sergeant First Class Daniel Whitmore in 2019, had served a 14-month combat deployment alongside him, and had been physically present when Daniel Whitmore was killed was by a secondary IED blast outside a village in a conflict zone that the public record still listed as a training accident. Ranger had not left her father's side for 11 hours after the blast. When the recovery team arrived, they had to sedate him to separate them. After that, Ranger had stopped listening to everyone. Maya understood that better than the behavioral assessment file ever would. Auction. At 10 sharp with a man named Clint Barrow at the podium auction house director, Cocky Pants, the easy authority of someone who ran events where money changed hands in ways that didn't require apology. Welcomed. The bidders ran through the ground rules and reminded everyone that all sales were final, all animals were sold as, and that bidding on behalf of third parties required advance written disclosure. The several lots moved quickly. German Shepherds. A pair of Labrador explosives detectors sold as a set to a county sheriff's department. Belgian Malinois younger than Ranger. Better rated that drew a bidding war between two firms and eventually went for $14,000 to a private executive protection company out of Westland. Maya watched all of it with her paddle in her lap and her folder closed. She was keeping mental track of who was bidding and how. Ironwell reps beside her was aggressive early, slowing down. Once prices moved past $12,000. The woman with the red pen was methodical, annotating each closing price. At the far right of the second row sat a man she'd noticed as soon as she walked in, not because of his size, though he was large, broad through the shoulders, and dressed in a suit that fit too well for the setting, but because of the way the room organized itself around him, slightly unconsciously the way a room subtly orients toward a gravitational pull. She'd overheard his name at the registration table while she was waiting. Victor Caldwell. She knew the name from a press release she'd found 2 months ago when she was digging into the institutional pipeline that funneled retired military working dogs into private security without oversight. Caldwell Defense Partners. 12 federal contracts, 6 figures each. Headquarters in a glass tower in the capital. The release said, was committed to maximizing the operational value of existing military assets while reducing training overhead costs. Existing military assets. She looked at him for a moment, the manicured hands, the phone he kept checking, the slight forward lean of a man who was used to being given things, and then she looked back at the platform where the handlers were setting up for the next lot. 19. A shepherd with a hip problem that would shorten his working life by 3 years. He sold for $3,200 to a K9 training schools upstate that would use him for demonstrations. 5. She watched the dog's body language as he was led away, tail low but not tucked head, slightly down, still working the room with his nose, even as the stress of the environment showed in the stiffness of his stride. She had 23 lots to go, then Ranger. 21. Victor Caldwell's phone buzzed, and he stepped out of his row to take the call near the side wall, close enough to Maya that she caught fragments of the conversation without trying. Athens. Already confirmed the pen space, and then he's the last lot, so yes, we have time. And then quieter, something that landed in her chest like a stone. Doesn't matter what the behavioral file says. We'll have him reconditioned in 60 days. She looked straight ahead at the platform, reconditioned. That was what they did with broken equipment. You stripped it back to factory settings and ran it through the cycle again. She pulled the photograph from the folder and looked at her father's hand resting on Ranger's neck, not gripping, not commanding, just resting, the kind of contact that was not about control at all. She put it back and squared the folder in her lap. 24 arrived at 11:48. She heard the reaction before she saw him, a shift in the room, a collective straightening of posture, a few murmured comments, a handler near the sides pen saying something in a clipped voice to a colleague. The doors at the rear of the staging area opened and Ranger came through. He came in hard, that was the only honest way to describe it. I had him on a 6-foot tactical leash, with a firm grip on a short lead attached to the bite harness, and even with that setup, Ranger was pulling enough that the handler's arm was at full extension. Shoulder, angled back body weight countering the forward drive. Ranger was not lunging randomly. He was scanning systematically, cycling through threat assessments as he moved through the unfamiliar space, and every person he fixed his gaze on felt it. He was not a pretty dog. The compact, powerful build that Belgian Malinois were bred for, but 3 combat deployments showed on him a lateral scar from his left shoulder across his ribcage, a notch in his left ear from something that had come too close, and a whitened patch around his right eye that told the story of a blast injury in language cleaner than any medical report. His coat was tawny and tan over dark. His face dark masked his eyes a clear amber color that caught the warehouse light and gave back something unsettling. He looked like a dog that had survived things by deciding nothing in the world was safe and had found no reason yet to change that conclusion. A handler got him onto the platform with visible effort. Ainge stood with his weight forward, alert and still scanning the rows of seated bidders. His gaze moved through the crowd in sweeps, and Maya, 2 rows back in center, stayed completely still when those amber eyes passed over her. They paused just for a fraction of a second that nobody else would have noticed. Then they moved on. Clint Barrows stepped to the microphone. 24. Belgian Malinois call sign Ranger, 7 years old. A tired military working dog. Multiple deployments. Multiple commendations. Available for placement with qualified professional organizations only. Reserve at 2,500 is noted in your catalog. I'll open bidding now. Red pen woman, 4,000. A man near the front. Maya hadn't tracked 5,500. Victor Caldwell, without looking up from his phone's 7,000. The room recalibrated. The Ironwell rep wrote something on his own catalog page and sat back. Circled something and put her pen down. 1,500, Maya said. The room shifted. She didn't say it loudly. She said it at normal conversation volume, clearly the way she called out a dosage change in the trauma bay when things were moving fast and she needed to be heard without contributing to the noise. Pointed paddle 47 7,500. I have 8. Caldwell finally looked up from his phone. Located her in the 3rd row. The young woman in the plain jacket, no company logo, no entourage. And the look on his face was not confusion. It was amusement. 8,000, he said easily. 500. Maya said. A murmur ran through the room. Not because of the dollar figure. These were professionals who dealt in tens of thousands without blinking, but because of the source. She could feel it, the way attention reorganized, the way men like Caldwell processed interruption as category error. She was in the wrong place. She should know that. The fact that she didn't was either stupidity or theater. Caldwell leaned slightly towards the man seated beside him, assistant colleague something, and said something quiet. The other man's 1,000, Caldwell said. Evasive. Final sounding. Maya said. The amusement left his face. She stayed in it through 13,000, and that was the outer edge of her account. Everything she'd saved over 4 years of night shifts and holiday differentials, and the emergency fund that wasn't supposed to touch. She knew it when she bid 13,500, that she was in free fall, that she didn't have the runway everyone else in this room had, that this was a place where wealth was infrastructure, and she was working without a net. But she also knew that Caldwell was watching her now, the way people watch things that puzzle them, and she was not going to give him the satisfaction of watching her fold. At 14,000 from Caldwell, she hesitated 3 full seconds that felt like standing at the edge of something with no clear bottom, and then she raised her paddle. 14.5. Caldwell put his phone in his jacket pocket. He turned in his chair to look at her directly, and the look was not respectful and not angry. It was the specific expression of a man recalculating, trying to figure out what game was being played. 1,000, he said. The number sat in the room. Tucker watched her from the podium, neutral professional doing his job. Aya lowered her paddle. The folder sat in her lap. She could feel the photograph under it, her father's hand on Ranger's neck, and she looked at the dog on the platform, who had been watching the bidding with the focused attention of an animal that understood something significant was happening, and she made herself breathe. 1,000. She was done. She had no more runway. Lying once at 16,000. She stood up not to bid. She stood up because she needed Ranger to see her standing, needed the sight line to be direct and unobstructed, and she stepped out of her row into the aisle. One of the auction staff moved immediately. Ma'am, bidders need to remain. I need to approach the animal, she said. I'm his handler family. I have documentation. That's not how this works, the man said. He was young, uncertain, glancing toward Barrow at the podium. Caldwell's voice came from his chair, easy and carrying. Somebody get this woman seated. Lost. It's over, it's not over, Maya said. She looked at him. You don't know what you're buying. I know exactly what I'm buying. He stood then, too, which she hadn't expected, with the casual physical authority of a man who had once been an athlete and kept enough of it to use. I'm buying a retired military asset. That's what this auction is. Not an asset. That's what the paperwork says. I have the paperwork. She says he failed 3 handlers. Doesn't say why. The room was fully quiet now. Afro had stepped back from the microphone. On the platform, Ranger had gone very still. I don't particularly care why, Caldwell said. That's not relevant to what I'm paying for. Something in Maya's chest went flat and cold and settled, the way it sometimes settled in the trauma bay when a situation clarified past the point of uncertainty into the specific necessary actions required. She turned away from Caldwell entirely and walked toward the platform. Handler moved in front of Ranger automatically, blocking approach. You can't be up here without clearance. I'm not going to touch him, Maya said. Right. She stopped 6 feet from the platform edge. I just need him to see me. Please. She looked at the handler directly. 20 seconds. He held he was ex-military himself. She could read it in the way he'd positioned himself, not aggressive, just solid, and something in her tone registered in a way that made him pause rather than escalate. On the platform, Ranger was looking at her, not scanning. Threat. Assessing in the sweeping way he'd been working the room. Steady, direct amber eyes fixed on her face, the way a dog looks at something familiar that it can't place, testing the recognition against 3 years of absence and noise in wrong hands. Maya crouched, not to make herself smaller or less threatening. She wasn't managing him, she was acknowledging him. She brought herself to his level, the way someone does when they know the animal across from them is not a dog in the way most people use that word, but a peer who has been in places most people can't imagine. She said it quietly, barely loud enough for the handler beside her to hear. Ranger Foos. Heel the German command, not on a leash, not paired with a gesture, just the word. Father's word, in her father's cadence, in the voice that Ranger had heard for 14 months across 2 continents. Ranger stopped pulling against the leash. His head lowered 2 inches. His breathing slowed. Every dog in the holding pens along the warehouse walls went quiet simultaneously, the way dogs do when the dominant animal in a space signals a change in status. The silence was instantaneous and complete, and deeply strange in a way that made several people in the room shift in their seats. Acro had stopped writing. The handler beside Ranger looked at the dog, then at Maya, then back at the dog, working through something that his training hadn't prepared him for. Caldwell said loudly, "Whatever this is, quiet." The command came from the back of the room, not from Maya, from a man who had been sitting in the last row since the auction opened, and whom Maya had not noticed because he had made a deliberate practice of not being noticed, and who was now standing, and whose voice carried the specific frequency of someone who had spent decades being listened to in high-noise environments. He was in his 60s, gray-haired civilian clothes, good wool coat, no logos, with the posture that never fully leaves the people who carry it long enough. He walked down the center aisle without hurrying, and stopped at the front of the room between the seated audience and the platform and looked at Ranger for a long moment. Then he looked at Maya. "How did you know that command?" he said. "I did." Maya stood back up. She was steady. She'd been steadier than this in worse rooms, my father taught me. He used it with Ranger on deployment when he needed to override a distraction recall. She paused. His name was Daniel Whitmore. The man went completely still. Behind him, a ripple ran through the room, a few people who recognized the name, a few who didn't, but could read the reaction in the man who'd spoken. "I know who Daniel Whitmore was," the man said quietly. "I figured you might," Maya said. "You're Elias Ward." Done her research. He nodded once, slow, the acknowledgement of a man who no longer bothers being surprised by being known. "When did you find out Ranger was here?" 6 weeks ago. "I found his transfer paperwork in my father's records." "His command didn't notify us, my mother, me, when Ranger was cycled out." "He was just listed as reassigned." She glanced at Ranger, who was still watching her from the platform with that fixed, quiet attention. "I filed 3 requests through official channels." Athens. None of them were answered. Ward's jaw tightened, a small movement most of the room wouldn't catch. He turned and looked at Victor Caldwell. Caldwell had not sat down, and he did not look pleased, but he looked less like a man in control of the room than he had 10 minutes ago. "Auction," he said. "Not a memorial service." The dog was sold through proper channels and the high bid is mine." "The bid hasn't closed," Barrow said from the podium carefully. "Does it?" Caldwell looked at the auctioneer. 16,000. "Going twice means 22,000, Ward said. Caldwell's expression changed. 22, Ward repeated. He reached into his coat and put a card on the nearest chair. "That's my contact at Hartfield Private Bank. I'll wire transfer before close of business today." The room was silent for a moment that had a particular quality to it, the silence of a space where power has just redistributed itself, and no one has quite finished calculating the new arrangement. "You're bidding on the dog," Caldwell said. It wasn't a question. It was a man verifying something he hadn't expected to need to process. No, Ward said. I'm buying her the dog. Caldwell left the building while the auction paperwork was still being processed, and Maya watched him go without satisfaction. Because the fury in his exit, the specific contained fury of a man who had not been denied in a professional setting in some time, told her something. This wasn't finished. A man like Caldwell didn't absorb a public loss and release it. Vibrated. She knew that she filed it and kept moving. The paperwork took 40 minutes. Ward stood nearby during the transfer process, not hovering, not orchestrating, just present in the way that made things move more smoothly, the way it did when someone with institutional weight stood in a room without having to use it directly. He answered questions from auction staff in clipped, clear sentences and asked nothing of Maya while she handled the forms. It was done. Ownership corrected, transfer signed, a new identification tag printed with her address in Porterfield. She was handed Ranger's leash. The handler who'd been working him all morning passed it over with a look that wasn't exactly emotional, but wasn't purely professional either. He'd been holding this dog for 8 weeks through the processing cycle, and he'd spent most of it losing ground instead of gaining it, and the expression on his face said he was relieved in a way he couldn't explain. Maya took the leash in her left hand and crouched again. Ranger, she said. He stepped forward, still on the leash, not dragging toward her, but voluntarily closing the distance in a slow, deliberate way that was nothing like the animal who had come through those rear doors barely 2 hours ago, pulling the handler's arm straight. He put his nose near her face, not quite touching, reading her in the specific, thorough way that working dogs read the people they have decided to trust with their serious attention. Him. After a moment, he exhaled through his nose, long, slow breath, and sat. She put her right hand against the side of his neck. His coat was coarser than she'd expected and warmer, carrying the stored heat of a dog who had been in stress all morning, and she could feel his pulse under her fingers, settling degree by degree from tactical to something quieter. Nothing. Sometimes nothing was exactly right. I'd found her in the parking lot afterward, loading Ranger into the back of her Jeep with the travel crate. She'd brought on the assumption she was going to win, and refused to examine too hard as a belief system. Stepped in without drama, which was not nothing given the morning. He served with your father for 14 months, Ward said, without preamble. He leaned against the side of a parked SUV, hands in his coat pockets facing her. I was his CO. For the last 7 of those, I know what Daniel could do in the field. I know what Ranger saw him do. Maya closed the crate door. Hush, she turned. Tell me. He saved 11 men in a valley outside of Ward. Stopped. He corrected the way people do when they've spent years navigating classification. Location I can't specify. Secondary IED, your father was the only medic on site. 5. He worked 5 simultaneous casualties over 2 hours in a space that was still taking fire and kept 4 of the 5 alive. Ranger ran perimeter the entire time solo and called a third approach before any of the team spotted the movement. Maya stood very still. When your father was hit by the secondary blast, Ward paused. Ranger went to him and he stayed. We didn't get to the site for 11 hours. He was still there. She looked at the crate. Ranger had turned in a circle inside it and lay down, his chin on his paws, watching through the mesh door with his amber eyes. Handlers. After that, she said, the 3 who failed. It wasn't broken, Ward said. He was waiting. She put her hand flat on the side of the Jeep and let that sit for a moment. Didn't anyone contact us when he was being cycled out? His expression shifted, not evasion, but weight. The specific weight of a man who has spent years in institutions that make decisions he agrees with in principle, and sometimes hates in specific. Protocol says. Surviving family is notified that notification didn't happen. 5. I'm looking into why, and I want you to know he stopped. Caldwell's been acquiring retired MWDs through this pipeline for 3 months. Ranger would have been the 4th. He's using them as static security assets in high-turnover contract sites. No proper handler assignment, no continuity of care. Deployment. His voice was very level. 2 of the previous 3 are already showing significant stress deterioration. I've been tracking this for 6 weeks, which is about how long you've been filing requests that weren't answered. The pieces rearranged themselves. She looked at him. You were already investigating. I became aware of a problem, he said carefully. Filing actually helped establish the pattern. And Caldwell knows you're looking. He will by the end of today. Maya nodded, processing. The sun had moved while they were inside. It was past noon now, the parking lot hot and almost empty. The auction staff visible through the warehouse's side door breaking down folding chairs. What happens next for Ranger? Ward looked at the crate. He goes home with you. That's where this should have ended 2 years ago. He looked back at her. For Caldwell. What I'm takes time, documentation, institutional channels. Not fast. But it happens, it will happen, he said. Life. It was not a promise the way people make promises when they want to be believed. It was a statement of operational intent from a man who had spent his career converting intent into outcome. She believed it. She reached into her jacket pocket and found the photograph. She'd brought it out from the folder during the bidding and kept it with her, and she looked at it one more time. Mother's hand. Ranger's neck, a moment of rest inside a life that hadn't had enough of them. She put the photograph on the passenger seat where she could see it. She was not someone who processed things fully in the moment. She was an ER nurse. She was built for forward motion in crisis, and she handled the residue later in quiet, in the dark, in the particular solitude of a person who had been moving fast for so long, that stillness sometimes felt like something she had to learn the shape of, again each time. She would handle this later. Now. She had a dog in the back of her Jeep and 4 hours of two-lane road between her and home, and Ranger had his chin on his paws and was watching her through the mesh with those amber eyes that had seen things nobody had words for. And she had a thermos of cold gas station coffee and no plans to stop. She started the engine in the back of the crate. Ranger lifted his head. She pulled out of the parking lot without looking in the rearview mirror. She was 3 miles down the highway when her phone buzzed on the passenger seat screen up. She glanced. Victor Caldwell, unknown contact number, no name in her system, but she recognized the area code. It was the same one from the press release she'd saved to her desktop 6 weeks ago. She hadn't given him her number. She looked at the road ahead. Phone buzzed again. Not a call this time, a text. She waited until the next straightaway to pick it up. You got the dog. That's fine. You should know that I know who you are, where you work, and that this isn't the last conversation we're going to have. She read it once. She put the phone back on the seat face down. In the rearview mirror, nothing followed her, just the highway and the scrubland and the flat blue sky of a November afternoon. The message sat in her chest with a weight. She recognized not fear exactly, not shock. A specific cold clarity of a problem that had named itself, and was therefore closer to solvable than the problems that hadn't. Ethinger shifted in the crate. He put his nose against the mesh and breathed. She kept driving. She made it home by 4:30. And Porterfield looked the same as it always did in late afternoon, the main strip quiet. The boats in the harbor rolling on the incoming tide. The salt and diesel smell coming off the water, that she had never once in her life found unpleasant. She turned off the coast road onto the gravel lane that led to the small blue-painted rental house she'd been in for 2 years. The one with the overgrown backlot and the landlord who didn't ask questions about pets because he'd never thought to put it in the lease. She backed the Jeep close to the back door before she let Ranger out of the crate, not because she expected trouble, but because she wanted the transition to be deliberate. Environment, unknown quantities. A dog who had not had a stable anchor in 3 years needed the first 5 minutes to go right. He stepped out of the crate and stood in her gravel lot and did what he'd been doing all day, systematic patient, working the space with his nose and his eyes, testing the air for anything that required a response. He found nothing threatening. After a minute, he looked at her. She pointed toward the house. Come on. He followed at her left heel without being asked. Muscle memory was in him, deep and unbroken, even after everything. Them both in through the back door and stood in the kitchen, while Ranger walked the perimeter of the downstairs, every room, every corner, nose low. The specific inventory of a working dog, check in a new operational space, and she put the kettle on because she needed something warm, and she hadn't eaten since 6 that morning, and the coffee had run out somewhere around hour 2 of the drive. When he came back to the kitchen, he sat near the back door at a distance that was neither crowding nor avoidance. Watching. You're going to need food, she said. She'd bought supplies before the auction, dry food, a proper working dog diet she'd researched for 2 weeks, a water bowl, a bed. She wasn't sure he'd use. She put the bowl down and filled it, and he ate with the focused efficiency of an animal that had learned to take sustenance when it was available without ceremony. She stood at the counter and drank her tea and watched him, and something in her chest that had been clenched since 6 that morning began very slowly to release. Buzzed again, not Caldwell's number this time, it was Lena. Marsh had been her charge nurse for 3 of her 4 years at Seaside General, and she called the way she did everything, directly, without preamble. The dog. I got the dog. Ward showed up. He did. Maya wrapped both hands around the mug. How did you know about Ward? You told me his name 6 weeks ago when you found the service records. I looked him up. He's not a small person, Maya. He's not. What about Caldwell? She considered how to say this and then said it plainly because Lena had a radar for softened information and a strong preference against it. I texted me after I left, said he knows where I work. I'll pause. He got your personal number apparently. That's not nothing. No, she agreed. She looked at Ranger, who had finished his food and was sitting near the door again, with his chin slightly raised, listening to the conversation, the way dogs listen, not to words, but to the structure underneath them. I'm going to call Ward in the morning, he needs to know. You could call him tonight, it's under control tonight. Is early enough. Lena, to her credit, did not push. Second, night shift. 7 to 7. Get some sleep before that. You sound like you've been running on nothing for 15 hours. 15, Maya said. That's not better. She hung up and stood in the kitchen for another minute with the mug and the sound of the harbor coming through the window over the sink, the soft clank of mooring lines. Somewhere off the breakwater, and Ranger watching her from near the door. Okay. She said to him same words she'd said in the parking lot this morning. It felt like it had been longer ago than that. She put the mug in the sink. Upstairs. She slept harder than she had in weeks. Saturday came fast the way it always did when you worked the back end of a week. And she arrived at Seaside General at 6:45 for the shift handoff with her badge clipped to her scrub jacket and her hair pulled back, and the particular internal gear change that she'd learned to make over 4 years of emergency nurse stepping from one reality into another, leaving the first one at the door, not because it didn't matter, but because the door required it. Ranger was with her neighbor Deb Foss, a retired school librarian in her 60s, who had offered without being asked, and who was the sort of person who could be trusted with something important precisely because she didn't treat everything as opportunity to demonstrate her trustworthiness. She simply did what was needed and didn't annotate it. General's Emergency Department was a Level 2 trauma center, 42 beds, serving a coastal catchment area that included 3 small cities and a sprawl of unincorporated communities along the highway. On a Friday night, it ran hot with the usual car accidents from the highway corridor, alcohol-related injuries, chest pain among the older population that lived along the water, and a rotating cast of everything else that happened when people were tired and afraid and running out of options and knew there was a lit building they could go to. Maya knew the floor the way she knew her own hands. She'd had bad nights here, nights where she'd worked past the point of competence, through nothing but structural refusal, and she'd had nights that were clean and well executed, and made her remember exactly why she'd chosen this. Saturday started as the second kind, and then around 1:30 in the morning crossed over. Came from Traj multi-vehicle accident on the coast highway 6 miles out. Vehicles estimated 4 casualties incoming, 1 confirmed critical. Minutes. She was already moving before the announcement finished. The trauma bay filled the way it always did. When mass casualty came through organized chaos, was the phrase people used, which wasn't quite right. It was more like a system under pressure, revealing whether its architecture held. Architecture at Seaside General held. Mostly because the people in it knew their roles and their limits and had worked together long enough to read each other's shorthand. The critical patient came off the ambulance with 2 paramedics and a blood pressure reading that made Maya's jaw tighten. Mid-40s, blunt thoracic trauma, spontaneous pneumothorax, developing blood pressure 60 over palp and dropping. Turned was Rosaria Vega, and she was a school teacher from Saltwick who had been on the highway at the wrong moment, and Maya knew this about her because the paramedic told her, and because Maya believed in practice, if not in formal philosophy, that the names mattered, that Rosaria Vega is to be a person in this room, and not just a pressure reading. They worked for 40 minutes, it was not clean. The chest drain placement was difficult in a way that made her call for a second set of hands, and then a third, not because she couldn't do it, but because speed and precision were competing, and at a certain point the argument for speed won. The pressure came up. It came up because she and the resident beside her and the respiratory tech at the head of the bed did their jobs in sequence without colliding, not because anything was easy. Rosaria Vega went to the ICU at 2:23 in the morning, intubated, sedated. 5. Maya stood in the hall outside the trauma bay for exactly 90 seconds after the bed went through the doors. She did the 90 seconds the way she always did after a hard case, just standing, just breathing, just letting the adrenaline begin its long exhale, and then she went back in for the next one. The rest of the shift was ordinary by comparison, which was the emergency department's version of a compliment. She got off at 7:15, stayed until 7:40 to finish her charting, and was in her car by 8 with the windows down, and the morning air coming off the harbor, and her hands still faintly trembling from the sustained effort of the last 7 hours, which was normal, which she didn't fight anymore the way she used to when she was new. She called Elias Ward on the way home. He picked up on the second ring. More. Caldwell texted me the night of the auction, she said. I should have told you sooner. I wanted to get through a shift first. A pause. She could hear something in the background movement. A door, the ambient sound of a space reorganizing around him. What did the message say? She read it to him from memory. She deleted it from the phone, but she had the kind of retention for exact language that nursing school had trained into her and hadn't left. He got your number. Said, I'm as Lena. Though the inflection was different. Where Lena had said it as a measure of the problem's gravity, Ward said it as a man adding data to a structure he was already building. That requires either someone from the auction staff or a deeper background search than a person runs in 40 minutes. Either of those is accidental. He paused again. I want you to keep that number active. Fuck it. If he contacts you again, forward it to the number I'm going to send you in the next 10 minutes. Who's the number? Someone who's been building a file on Caldwell Defense Partners for 4 months. Your situation is relevant to what they have. She turned onto the gravel lane toward the house. Through the back window of Deb's place next door, she could see Ranger in the yard, a dark shape, moving deliberately through the overgrown grass at the property edge, working the fence line. Kind of file. The kind that takes time to be worth anything, Ward said. Are you all right? The question was direct and matter-of-fact, and she understood that it was not casual inquiry. I'm fine. I worked a long shift. I'm going home. Good. He paused, and in the pause she heard him deciding something. 2 of the dogs Caldwell acquired before Ranger, one of them is already showing behavioral deterioration, significant enough that his contracted site manager filed a welfare complaint. Caldwell's company responded by transferring the dog to a different facility and reclassifying the complaint as resolved. He moved the dog instead of addressing the problem. She sat in her car in the driveway with the engine off, looking at the backyard where Ranger was now sitting at the fence line looking toward the harbor. That's not an isolated incident, that's a pattern. That's what a pattern looks like. She got out of the car. The morning was cool and the harbor smell was clean, and somewhere down the lane, a neighbor's radio was playing something she couldn't identify. I'll wait for the contact you're sending. She went inside and slept until 2 in the afternoon, and when she woke up, Ranger was asleep at the foot of her bed, which was not where she'd put his sleeping mat, but she left it alone. The contact Ward had promised turned out to be a woman named Priya Sathian, and she called rather than texted, which was a data point Maya filed without comment. Told me you'd be in touch, Maya said. He told me the same about you. Priya's voice was mid-range, unhurried, carrying the precision of someone who spent her professional life choosing words for maximum accuracy. I work for the Defense Accountability Office, civilian branch. I'm about to tell you is not classified. But it's not in any press release either. Okay. Caldwell Defense Partners has 3 federal contracts for security services at sensitive installations. All 3 contracts include language permitting the use of trained working animals as part of the security profile. But the contracts don't specify, and what we've been documenting is that Caldwell is sourcing those animals through the retired military pipeline without the welfare provisions that the pipeline is supposed to guarantee. Maya sat at her kitchen table with a notebook. The provision that requires documented handler continuity, among others. You know the pipeline? I filed 3 requests through it, and none of them were answered. A short silence. Those requests should have for review within 10 business days. If they didn't, someone closed them without processing. Another pause. Copies of those filings. I'll send them today. There's something else, Priya said. Caldwell's legal team sent a communication to Iron Ridge Tactical this morning. They're claiming the auction was improperly conducted and that the winning bid should be voided on procedural grounds. The kitchen was quiet. Ranger was at the back door looking out through the glass, his shoulder blade visible under his coat as his attention fixed on something in the yard. A bird, probably, or the wind changing. On what grounds? They're arguing that Elias Ward's bid constituted outside interference in a regulated sale, because Ward has an institutional relationship with the Defense Department and the dog was defense-issued property. Priya's voice stayed level. It's a weak argument legally, but if Iron Ridge gets spooked and agrees to review, the ownership transfer could be suspended pending arbitration. Aya looked at Ranger's back. She kept her voice even. How long would arbitration take with Caldwell's legal resources? He could stretch it to 8 months. 8 months. She pressed her pen against the notebook without writing anything. 8 months of Ranger in some holding facility, in legal limbo, in the kind of institutional nowhere that had already cost him 3 years. What do I need to do right now? Nothing. Let us do our part. Is filing a response through official channels today, and I'm expediting a welfare review of all 3 dogs Caldwell currently holds. That review creates a documented record that undermines his operational claims. She paused. The difficulty is that Caldwell has relationships in several of the offices that would normally process these reviews. It slows things down. Someone's protecting him. I didn't say that, you didn't. Not say it. Another short silence, and something shifted in Priya's voice, not warmth exactly, but the specific quality of a professional who has found a civilian who understands how the machinery works. Keep your head down for the next week. Don't give Caldwell anything to point to as provocation. If he contacts you again, forward it immediately. She said she would. She hung up and sat at the table for a long time after that. Notebook open, nothing written on the page. Inge turned from the door and looked at her. I know, she said. To the table and sat beside her chair. He didn't put his head in her lap. He wasn't that kind of dog, didn't perform comfort the way dogs in films did. It simply sat proximate, present. The way he must have sat beside her father in 100 places that were neither safe nor easy. She put her hand on the top of his head once briefly. Then she picked up her pen and started writing down everything she remembered from the 3 months of research before the auction: names, dates, filing numbers, every detail she'd accumulated and stored against the possibility that she might need it in exactly this kind of moment. This legal challenge from Caldwell's team arrived formally at Iron Ridge Tactical on Wednesday, and by Thursday morning, Maya knew about it from 3 sources: Priya's office, a call from Ward, and a terse email from Clint Barrow at the auction house, advising her that a procedural review had been initiated and that she should seek her own legal counsel while the matter was pending. She read Barrow's email twice. He was protecting himself, which she understood. She didn't hold it against him. She called the only lawyer she knew personally, Jasper Okafor, who had grown up 2 streets from her in Porterfield, gone to law school at 30, after a decade working the fishing boats, and now ran a small practice handling maritime contracts and the occasional dispute that didn't fit neatly into any established category. He was not a defense attorney. He was not a federal contract specialist. But he was methodical. He was stubborn, and he owed her a favor from the time she'd spent 6 hours in the ER with his mother during a cardiac event and not left until she was stable. I need help, she told him, not the kind you usually do. He drove to her house that evening and sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and listened to all of it without interrupting, which was one of the things she valued most about him. When she finished, he wrote something on the pad and looked at it. The ownership transfer was completed and filed before Caldwell's legal challenge was submitted. 6 hours. And the Caldwell argument rests on the claim that Ward's bid constituted institutional interference. That's what Priya Sathian says. Who is Priya Sathian to you legally? Contact. She called me. She works for the Defense Accountability Office. Jasper wrote something else. Okay, here's what we do. I draft a counter-response to Iron Ridge's review that documents the timeline of the completed transfer and attaches the ownership record. Caldwell's team is going to argue procedural grounds. So we argue procedural grounds right back. The process was followed, the transfer is clean, and any attempt to void it. Post-completion requires a showing of fraud or material misrepresentation. It's neither of which they can establish. He tapped the pad. Is there anything about your bid process or your documentation that they could characterize as irregular? She thought about the moment she'd stepped out of her bidding row and walked toward the platform. I approached the dog during the auction. Jasper looked at her. What do you mean approached? I stepped into the aisle. One of the auction staff told me to sit down. Did you bid again after that? Well, but after that I'd already dropped out on price. So you weren't the winning bidder technically, no. Was he bought the dog on my behalf, which he disclosed at the time? Disclosed verbally in front of the room, not in writing. Jasper exhaled through his nose. That's the weak point. Caldwell's team is probably going to argue that the oral disclosure doesn't constitute the written third-party bidding. Notice that the auction's terms require eyes. She'd known this was coming. She'd been carrying it since the parking lot. Void the transfer. It's a procedural irregularity. It doesn't automatically void anything, but it gives them a hook to pull on. He looked at her steadily. How much does Ward want to be involved in fixing this? As he was filing a response today, I need to talk to him. Jasper flipped, if possible. She called Ward. He answered in 2 rings again, and she put him on speaker and sat back, while he and Jasper talked with the particular efficiency of two people who had both spent careers in rooms where precision mattered more than volume. I'd confirmed what he'd submitted to the auction house, added two facts. She hadn't known that the auction company's own terms had a provision allowing for oral third-party disclosure under certain conditions, which his legal team was now citing, and agreed to share his filings with Jasper directly. When the call ended, Jasper looked at his pad. He's further along on this than I expected. He's been expecting this kind of pushback from Caldwell specifically, from the system that Caldwell operates in. She picked at the edge of her pen cap, a habit she'd had since nursing school when she was working through something difficult. Odd, said Caldwell has relationships inside the offices that would normally review him. It's not just a legal problem. Jasper was quiet for a moment. You're saying someone's been running interference for Caldwell inside the military welfare system? I'm saying it's possible. Priya implied it. If that's true, this gets considerably more complicated. He closed the legal pad. Keep your documentation, everything, the original records you found, the filings you submitted, the text from Caldwell, all of it. Whatever's happening here is going to move through formal channels eventually, and when it does, the paper trail you've built is going to matter. At 9, and she stood in the kitchen after the door closed and listened to the house. 9's Ranger was upstairs. She could hear the particular nothing sound of a sleeping dog, the absence of movement that had its own specific texture. She was tired in the layered way that happened when physical exhaustion and cognitive load ran simultaneously for too long, and she knew she needed sleep. But she sat at the kitchen table a little longer with the notebook and added the day's medical care she used for nursing documentation, dates, times, names, exact language where she had it. She was still writing when her phone buzzed. Not Caldwell. Ward, not Lena. It was a local number she didn't recognize, Athens, and when she answered, the voice on the other end was male, young. Professionally careful in a way that had the specific texture of someone reading from a prepared statement while trying to sound spontaneous. Miss Whitmore. I'm calling on behalf of a client who would like to speak with you directly. He's prepared to offer a resolution that would benefit all parties. She kept her voice completely neutral. What client? I'm not able to say that, then I'm not interested. She moved her finger toward the end button. More. The voice changed, barely losing a layer of the prepared quality. A client is aware of your current legal situation with Iron Ridge. He's prepared to withdraw the procedural challenge and allow the ownership transfer to stand in exchange for a brief conversation. She was very still. A conversation, that's all. It's in person, at a location of your choosing, with whatever representation you feel is appropriate. She looked at the notebook in front of her at Jasper's name written at the top of the last page. Tell your client I'll consider it, she said. She hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand and understood with the cold clarity that had been her companion through the entire day that this was not an offer. This was a test. Caldwell wanted to know whether she could be managed, whether the right pressure applied to the right point would produce a pliable outcome. Whether she was the kind of person who folded when the alternative to folding came with a price tag attached. He had read her wrong at the auction. He was reading her wrong now. But he was also, and this was the part she couldn't ignore, in a position where the wrong move on her part would put Ranger back in legal limbo for 8 months, and she did not know yet if the right channels moved fast enough to prevent that. She forwarded the call information to Priya's number. Then she texted Ward a summary in 4 sentences. His response came back in 3 minutes. Don't agree to any meeting. We're moving faster than Caldwell knows. On by. She read it twice. She went upstairs. Ranger was awake now, lying at the foot of the bed, with his ears angled toward the window where the harbor sounds came through, and when she came in, he tracked her with his eyes but didn't move. She sat on the edge of the bed where it says stand by, she told him. Put his head back down on his paws. His amber eyes stayed open. She lay back and stared at the ceiling and tried to calculate what moving faster than Caldwell knows meant in concrete terms, and how long faster would take others, and whether 8 months was a number she could actually fight, or just a number she'd been handed to see what she'd do with it. Her phone buzzed one more time before she slept. This time it was a news alert, a regional outlet. She followed for coastal city coverage, not because she was a particular news consumer, but because it tracked the harbor authority decisions that affected her neighborhood. She opened it without expectation. The headline was 3 seconds of reading: Caldwell defense partner under federal review following whistleblower filing. 3 active government contracts suspended pending investigation. Shut up. She read the full article in 90 seconds. It was short, breaking news, sparse on detail, but it named Caldwell by name, named the contracts by federal project number, and used the phrase welfare of military working animals in a way that told her exactly where the investigation had originated. 5. She called Priya. Priya picked up on the first ring, which told her something. Priya said 60 seconds ago, "Is this your office?" Eiffel. Is Priya said carefully from a source with first-hand knowledge of Caldwell's operational practices. It was submitted this afternoon and expedited through an emergency review track. The whistleblower from inside Caldwell's company. I can't confirm the source. 5. You just told me it was someone with first-hand operational knowledge. Pause. The filing creates an automatic suspension of the federal contracts pending review. That removes Caldwell's primary argument for needing the dogs. Maya was standing in the middle of her bedroom, now phone pressed to her ear, Ranger, watching her from the bed. The procedural challenge at Iron Ridge. Without the contract justification, Priya said, the challenge becomes significantly harder to sustain. His legal team will know that by morning. She stood very still for a moment, processing the velocity of it. Who filed another pause longer this time? When Priya answered, her voice was careful in a way that carried its own weight. Who served with your father? Who has been watching what's been done with dogs like Ranger for 3 months, and finally had documentation strong enough to act on. Maya sat back down on the edge of the bed. Ranger lifted his head. From somewhere in the house, she heard the harbor wind come through a window. She'd left cracked the same sound she'd been hearing since childhood. The specific salt and motion sound of water that had always meant the place where everything eventually returned. And for the first time since she'd read Caldwell's text in her car 3 days ago, the thing clenched in the center of her chest released enough that she could breathe past it. Over. She understood that Ward's standby meant something was still in motion, and whistleblower filings and contract suspensions were not the same as resolved. And Caldwell was not the kind of man who absorbed a public loss and went quiet, as the text message had already demonstrated. But something had shifted. The ground had moved, and it had moved toward her. She looked at Ranger. He was sitting up now, fully alert, his amber eyes on her face with that fixed reading attention that she was beginning to understand was not wariness. It was the way he'd been trained to watch the person beside him, monitoring, assessing, tracking the subtle signals that told him what state the situation was in. He had been doing this since her driveway. He had been doing this. She realized, since the auction platform, since the moment she'd crouched, and he'd walked toward her of his own choosing. He was working, he was still working in the only way he knew how. We're not done, she told him, but we're not where we were. He held her gaze for a moment, then lay back down with his head on his paws. She put the phone on the nightstand and lay back in the dark and tried to sleep, and she was almost there in the half-lit space between waking and gone, where the day finally started releasing its hold, when her phone lit up with a call that made her come back fully awake in a single second. The number was Jasper's at 11:40 at night, she answered. His voice was wrong, not alarmed, not panicked. Jasper didn't do either of those, but carrying something tight and controlled that she recognized from the way people spoke in the ER when they were managing information they hadn't fully processed yet. I just got a call from Iron Ridge's legal office. They received a counterfiling from Caldwell's team an hour ago. I saw the news about the federal review he's trying to move before. Not about the auction, Jasper said. He's filing a separate action. You personally, she sat up, harassment. Interference with lawful business practice, and Jasper stopped for a half-second, and in that half-second she heard him choosing how to say the next part. He's claiming you have a pattern of conduct that includes misrepresenting your professional credentials, and he's sent a copy to the licensing board at Seaside General. The room was completely quiet. He's going after your nursing license, Jasper said. She didn't sleep. She lay in the dark for 20 minutes, running the calculation, the specific cold arithmetic of what Caldwell had actually done and what it meant in practice, and then she got up, lying still, while something required action was a form of losing. She'd never been able to tolerate. The nursing license complaint wasn't random. That was the first thing she understood clearly. It wasn't a man lashing out. It was a man who had done research before the auction, who had known her name and her employer within hours of meeting her, and who had identified the exact pressure point most likely to produce either capitulation or distraction. Licensing board complaint at Seaside General meant a mandatory administrative review, which meant her supervisor was notified, which meant HR was involved, which meant she was working under scrutiny, while simultaneously trying to fight a legal battle on 2 fronts with no institutional resources behind her. She could admit that while hating it, She made coffee at midnight and sat at the table and called Jasper back. He answered immediately, which told her he hadn't gone to bed either. What exactly does the complaint allege, she said. Things. She heard him turning pages 1, that you misrepresented your relationship to the dog, and his handler history and communications with Iron Ridge Tactical. 2. That you interfered with the lawful auction process by approaching an animal outside established safety protocols. 3. And this is the one that goes to the licensing board, that you accessed protected military service records without prior authorization in order to obtain information you then used for personal and financial gain. She wrapped her hand around the mug. The service records I obtained through a retired G officer who had lawful access to them and shared them with me voluntarily. That's your defense. Yes, but Caldwell's filing characterizes it differently. He's saying you obtained them under false pretenses, that you misidentified yourself to get access. I identified myself as Daniel Whitmore's daughter. That's what I am. His filing says you implied you were acting in an official capacity. He set the mug down. That's a lie, no, Jasper said. It's a lie that requires documentation to disprove, and documentation takes time, and in the meantime the licensing board will send Seaside General a formal inquiry, and your employer has to respond to it. And it becomes my problem at work regardless of the outcome. She understood the mechanism. Who do I call at the hospital? Your nurse manager. First thing in the morning. Before they get the inquiry from the board, if possible. You want to be the one who tells them, not the one who's already the subject of an investigation when they find out. That's manageable, she said, and meant it not easy manageable, which was a different category. Jasper's voice shifted. There's a fourth element I didn't mention. His filing includes a request for an emergency injunction that would suspend your ownership of the dog pending resolution of all 3 proceedings. She sat very still. He's arguing that an individual under investigation for professional misconduct and records fraud shouldn't be the legal owner of a federal military asset. Isn't a federal asset anymore. He's a retired civilian dog. Technically correct. Caldwell's lawyers are arguing technically incorrect, and the burden of proof in an emergency injunction is lower than you'd want it to be. He paused. Judge could grant it within 72 hours. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about Ranger upstairs, about the specific sound of his breathing in the dark, about the way he'd eaten his food that first night with the quiet efficiency of an animal finally operating in a space that wasn't hostile. What do I need from Ward? He has as fast as he can produce it. Documentation of the service record acquisition process, documentation of the auction terms, a statement regarding the oral third-party disclosure and why it was procedurally valid. A pause than anything he has on Caldwell's prior conduct with the other dogs. If we can show a pattern of bad faith in the legal challenge, we can argue the injunction request is retaliatory rather than legitimate. I'll call him at 6. I'll have a draft response filed by noon. She hung up and sat in the kitchen for a long time with the coffee going cold beside her, and Ranger came downstairs. At some point she didn't hear him on the stairs, which told her something about how quietly a working dog moved when he chose to and sat beside her chair. The way he had 2 days ago, present and still. And she put her hand on his head and left it there, while she worked through the next 12 hours in her mind, step by step. The way she worked a complicated intake, triage first, then sequence, then execute. She had fought harder in worse rooms. She reminded herself of that. She called her nurse manager, Donna Vasquez, at seat in the morning before the day shift started and before Donna had a chance to see anything in her institutional email. Donna was 53, had been managing the Seaside General ED floor for 11 years, and was the kind of person who responded to bad news with a silence that lasted exactly as long as it took her to understand the situation fully. After which she responded with precision. Silence. This time lasted about 12 seconds. Licensing board complaint, Donna said. Initiated by Victor Caldwell, whose name you can search. He has 3 federal contracts under investigation as of last night. The complaint is retaliatory and I can document that, but the process will take time I may not have. What does the complaint allege? Maya told her, the same way she'd told Jasper directly, without softening, because Donna's respect for her depended on being given the straight version. Other silence, shorter. You access the records legally? Through a retired JIG officer with lawful access who shared them voluntarily. I have the exchange documented the approach during the auction. I stepped into the aisle. The animal responded. No safety incident occurred. It's not how a licensing board frames it. No, Maya agreed. Donna exhaled once controlled. I'm going to need to notify the CMO and HR when I get in. Hospital protocol. I know. I wanted you to hear it from me first. I appreciate that. A pause. How are you doing with this? It was a genuine question from a woman who had seen Maya through 4 years of hard nights and knew the difference between professional stability and actual well-being. I'm operational, Maya said. I'll stay operational. That's not quite what I asked. I know. She looked at the kitchen window where the morning light was just starting to come gray off the water. I'm angry, but I'm not distracted. Donna's voice was level. I want you to know that until the board process produces something definitive, you're on full active status. I'm not pulling you from the floor over a complaint. Thank you. Don't thank me, just handle it, she called Ward at 6:15. He answered as though he'd been awake for hours, which he probably had. She gave him the full picture, Jasper's summary, the injunction request, the 72-hour window, and he listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, Caldwell moved faster than I expected. You told me to stand by. I stood by. That's not a criticism. His voice was focused, carrying the rapid internal gear shift of someone recalculating a timeline. The injunction is the critical threat. If a judge grants it, we lose the ground we have, and we're fighting uphill on 2 fronts simultaneously. Jasper needs your documentation by noon. He'll have it by 9. A pause. I'm also going to make a call that I'd been saving. There's a federal magistrate in the district who handled 2 prior MWD welfare cases. She knows the law on military animal status better than anyone currently on the bench. If Caldwell's team files the injunction in her jurisdiction, we want to make sure she's the one who sees it. She understood what that meant, and she didn't ask the question out loud. There were forms of institutional influence that operated within the law and moved faster than the law's official processes, and Ward had spent 30 years building relationships in exactly that space. She didn't have a vocabulary that was comfortable with it, but she understood that comfort was not the relevant metric. She said, to see Seaside General for her Tuesday day shift at 6:05. And the floor had the particular rhythm of a morning handoff, tired faces passing the patient load to alert ones. The ritual of sign-out that was at once clinical and deeply human. She took her assignment, 7 patients, including 2 holdovers from the overnight who needed updating and 1 psych hold waiting for a bed upstairs, and she worked through the morning with the focused forward motion that the floor required. At 10:30, HR called her into a small conference room near the administrative wing. 2 people, a woman from HR named Tina Allard and the hospital's legal liaison, a quiet man named Peter Farrow who had a yellow legal pad and the careful eyes of someone paid to assess risk. They told her the licensing board inquiry had arrived electronically at 8:15 a.m. They told her the hospital was obligated to respond within 30 days. They told her she remained on full active status pending the board's review. They asked her if she wanted to make a statement for the hospital's response file. She said yes and made it 4 minutes, no notes. She gave dates, the name of the J officer, the documentation she had, the sequence of events at the auction, the text from Caldwell, and the timing of his law filings relative to the federal contract suspension news. She kept the language flat and factual, the way she documented a patient encounter, observable data sequence, no interpretation beyond what the evidence supported. Peter Farrow had stopped writing halfway through and was just listening. When she finished, Tina Allard looked at Peter Farrow. Make a copy of this statement, Farrow said. I'll have it to you by end of day. She walked back out to the floor and picked up where she'd left off. At noon, Jasper texted Ward's documents are extraordinary. Telling response now. Also, his legal contact confirmed the injunction request landed in Magistrate Holloway's court this morning. She read the text between patients and typed back, is that good? 3 minutes later, Very Holloway ruled against a similar Caldwell-adjacent filing 18 months ago. She knows the playbook. She pocketed the phone and went back to room 7, where a 64-year-old man named Arthur Price was running a fever that had spiked an hour ago and needed reassessment, because the floor did not stop for the complications in her personal life. And Arthur Price had nothing to do with any of it and deserved her full attention. She gave it at 2:45 in the afternoon, Prasathian called. Maya stepped into the clean utility room, 2 seconds of quiet between the noise of the floor, and answered. Whistleblower, Priya said. He's agreed to go on record. Name. Sworn statement. Documentary evidence of Caldwell's operational directives regarding the dog's paws. Name is Marcus UN. He's been Caldwell's site operations manager for 14 months. Documented everything. She leaned against the supply shelf. I know. The news was out last night, because last night he saw Caldwell file against you personally. He said Priya stopped choosing words. He said he'd been willing to work through channels quietly, but watching Caldwell go after someone's livelihood over a dog that belonged to a dead soldier was the line he wouldn't cross. She didn't say anything for a moment. His statement covers all 3 dogs. Documented behavioral deterioration, welfare complaints that were buried internally, directives from Caldwell explicitly instructing staff to reclassify welfare complaints as resolved without review. Priya's voice carried the controlled quality of a professional delivering significant information without editorializing. It also covers something we didn't have before. An internal communication in which Caldwell's director of operations refers to the retired MW pipeline as a cost-efficient sourcing channel and explicitly notes that the welfare provisions are not operationally enforceable in practice. That's not a gray area, Maya said. No, it's not. She pushed off the shelf. Does this affect the injunction timeline? Holloway received the motion this morning. She's scheduled a hearing for Friday at 2 p.m. And statement will be in the court record before then. A pause. I need you to be at that hearing. I'll be there. Ward. If he can come, he'll come. She hung up and stood in the clean utility room for 10 seconds with her hand flat on the supply shelf, breathing through the convergence of everything that was moving at once. Then she went back to the floor. The shift ended at 7. She changed in the locker room and drove home on the coast road, with the windows cracked and the salt air coming through, and Ranger waiting at the back door of the house where Deb had let him out for the afternoon. She sat in the driveway for a moment before going in because she needed a break in the continuity, a place to set down the day before she carried it inside. She called her mother, Eleanor. Whitmore lived in a small house in the hills 2 hours north of Porterfield and had been widowed for 3 years and had the specific quality of grace that some people develop when they've survived things that could have destroyed them. I've decided for reasons that don't always reduce to logic to keep going anyway. She answered on the 3rd ring with the particular calm of someone who keeps their phone nearby without being ruled by it. I heard something, Maya said. About Dad, about what he did the day he was killed. I've told me silence. Careful not empty, 5 casualties. 5. He kept 4 of them alive in a location that was still taking fire. She stopped. Again. Ranger ran the perimeter solo the whole time. 5. They found them together 11 hours later. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. 5. When she spoke, her voice was steady in the way it got when she was holding something too heavy for words to fully carry. I always knew it was something like that, the way they handled the notification. The way Ward called me personally afterward, some things you know without being told. I'm sorry. It took this long to say it out loud. You're saying it now. They talked for 20 minutes, not about Caldwell or the injunction or the licensing board, about Ranger, about the way he'd eaten his first meal, the notch in his ear, and the white patch around his eye, and what her father would have thought about him, ending up in a rental house near the harbor in Porterfield. Eleanor laughed at that last part. Brief and warm, and Maya held on to it. After she hung up inside, Ranger met her at the door. Not the frantic greeting of a pet who has been alone, the quiet, deliberate acknowledgement of a partner returning a resumption of contact between 2 individuals who had agreed, without the benefit of language, to be responsible for each other. She made eggs for herself and ate standing at the counter. She reviewed Jasper's filed response on her laptop while Ranger lay beside the table and the harbor made its nightly sounds. She was almost through the document when her phone buzzed. Text. Hearing confirmed Friday 2 p.m. Caldwell's clerk called Caldwell's attorney for a preliminary brief. His team requested postponement. She denied it. She read it twice. And the second message, arriving 30 seconds after the first. There is something you need to know before Friday. How Ranger's original handler assignment was processed and why the family notification didn't happen. It wasn't administrative error. She stared at the screen. Someone inside the system closed your request deliberately. I have a name. We need to talk before the hearing because this person is still in a position to interfere. The house was quiet around her. Ranger lifted his head from his paws and looked at her, reading her stillness. It's the way he read everything with the complete, focused attention of an animal who had learned that the moment before something changed always had a particular quality to it. Back. Who the 3 dots appeared, held for a long time. Then Ward's answer came through, and she read the name once, and the floor of everything she thought she understood shifted underneath her. The name on her screen was Colonel Dennis Farr. She knew it. Not from the auction, not from Caldwell's filings, not from anything in the last 3 weeks. She knew it from a letter she'd found in her father's storage boxes 8 months after his death, tucked inside a field notebook between 2 pages of medical supply calculations. A single paragraph, handwritten, dated 4 months before Daniel Whitmore deployed for the last time. The paragraph described a disagreement about protocol during a joint training exercise. Decision Farr had made that Daniel believed put 3 personnel at unnecessary risk, and Daniel's formal objection, which Farr had received, acknowledged, and the letter implied resented. She had read it once and put it back because Grief had many rooms and she couldn't be in all of them at once. She called Ward immediately. He picked up in one ring. The name. Tell me how he's connected. Farr was the administrative liaison between JSOC and the Military Working Dog Program for 2 years. He processed handler assignments and retirement transfers, which means he controlled whether family notifications went out. Ward's voice was level, carrying the weight of something he'd been sitting with for longer than tonight. Your 3 requests for information about Ranger went through his office. All 3 were logged as received, and then closed without action, not rejected closed. It's no documentation of review, no forwarding, nothing. He buried them. And when Ranger was cycled into the civilian auction pipeline, Farrar's office was the one that classified him as no surviving family contact, which is how he ended up at Iron Ridge without any of us being notified. A pause. Retired from active service 14 months ago. She already knew where this was going. Where does he work now? He's a senior advisor at Caldwell Defense Partners. She sat down at the kitchen table. Ranger was watching her from the other side of the room with the focused stillness that she had learned over the past week to read as his version of attention rather than agitation. He wasn't protecting the system, she said. He was building the pipeline. For identified which dogs had the strongest handler histories, suppressed the family notification process to remove competing claims, and routed them into Iron Ridge, where Caldwell had first choice access. Ward's voice was careful but not detached. We believe this started approximately 2 years ago. Was not the first, and he wouldn't have been the last. She thought about her father's letter, the formal objection. Did this have anything to do with my father specifically, or was Ranger just? I don't know. Ward said, I want to be honest with you about that. And your father had a documented professional conflict. Whether that motivated any of this specifically, I don't have enough to say. What I have is enough to show that Farrar systematically abused his administrative position to facilitate Caldwell's acquisition program. She pressed her thumb into the edge of the table. Does Priya know? I sent her the documentation 2 hours ago. She's working with the federal investigation team tonight. Is Farrar named in the hearing Friday? Not yet. A Caldwell injunction hearing is focused on Ranger's ownership status. Yoon's sworn statement references internal communications from a senior advisory contact without naming him. His office is determining whether to name Farrar formally in a supplemental filing before Friday or hold that for the broader investigation. If they hold it, she said, Farrar could interfere with the hearing. That's the calculation, yes. She looked at the window. The harbor was dark, just the distant navigation lights of a boat, moving on the water, red and white, slow. Does naming him due to the broader case? Tips our hand early. Gives his attorneys time to construct a response before the investigation has everything it needs. He paused. It also removes him from the board immediately, which protects the Friday hearing. There was no clean answer. She understood that option carried a cost, and the cost was paid by different people depending on which one you chose. This was a familiar structure to her, the triage of competing priorities, and she was not comfortable with it, but she was not paralyzed by it either. What would you do? A longer pause than she expected. I'd name him Friday and accept the risk to the broader case. Because the broader case can survive losing some strategic advantage. The hearing can't survive interference if we don't. Fine. Then that's what we do. After she hung up, she sat at the table for a while without moving. Ranger got up from his position across the room and walked to the table and sat beside her chair closer than he'd been before, his shoulder touching her calf. You knew, she said quietly. Not a real statement. Just words for the space. Not stay past. In the strange, suspended quality of a day before something significant, not slow exactly, but attenuated every hour, carrying a mild pressure. She worked a half shift at Seaside General in the morning, covering 2 admissions and a complex wound management case that kept her occupied for 3 hours in a way she was grateful for. Licensing board complaints sat in her administrative file, open and unresolved. But Donna Vasquez had made it clear in a brief hallway conversation that the floor wasn't treating her differently, and at noon she met Jasper at his office. He had the hearing documents spread across his desk in the organized arrangement that was his version of controlled chaos. And he walked her through them with the methodical clarity that made her trust him, not the polish of someone performing competence, but the specific rhythm of a person who had thought hard about something and wanted to make sure you understood it the same way. Always seen the Yoon statement, he said. Her clerk confirmed it's in the record. Caldwell's team submitted a motion to exclude it as prejudicial to the injunction proceeding, and she denied it in about 4 hours, which is fast for her. That's a signal. That's a signal, he agreed. She's not inclined to let this become a procedural wrestling match, he tapped a page. Office Ops filed a supplemental brief this morning naming Farrar. Caldwell's attorneys received it at 10 a.m. How did they respond? They haven't yet, which is interesting. He looked at her. Normally when you name someone of Farrar's background in a federal filing, you get an immediate motion to strike. Nothing. It's been 2 hours. She thought about what that meant. They didn't know Priya had him, that's my read. So Caldwell didn't know the investigation had gone that far. Apparently not. Jasper picked up his pen and turned it over in his fingers, a habit she'd noticed before. Which means Farrar was managing that exposure himself. He didn't tell Caldwell how far in he was, the implication settled. They're not coordinating their defense, they are now. But they had 2 hours less than they needed. She drove home after the meeting and took Ranger out along the coast path for an hour. Not because she had the mental space for a long walk, but because he needed to move, and she needed the physical reality of the ocean air and the cold November ground and the specific gray quality of the afternoon light off the water that had always logic, for reasons she couldn't reduce to logic, made her feel more like herself. He moved at her left heel without a leash, tracking the path with his nose, occasionally ranging ahead to assess a section before she reached it, and then returning not because she'd commanded it, but because it was the pattern he'd been trained to. And the pattern was still in him, reliable and clean. She thought about her father on that path. He had never walked it. He'd never been to Porterfield. The rental house was 3 years more recent than his death, but she thought about him anyway. The way you think about people who shaped how you move through the world, even when they're no longer moving through it, it's beside you. She didn't cry. She wasn't someone who cried in process, only in aftermath. She just walked and Ranger walked, and the harbor light failed slowly toward evening. The federal courthouse in Kessler was 40 minutes from Porterfield on the interstate, a building with the particular gravity of public institutional architecture, not beautiful, but weighted, solid, designed by people who believed that the permanence of the structure communicated something about the permanence of what happened inside it. She arrived at 1:15 with Jasper beside her and Ward already in the lobby, standing with a woman she hadn't met, process shorter than she'd expected from the phone presence, with the specific composure of someone who had been inside many courtrooms and had stopped needing them to be dramatic in order to find them meaningful. Whitmore. Priya said, a handshake firm, brief, businesslike. Ward's told me enough. I want you to know what you're walking into. They tell me Caldwell's team has 3 attorneys present. That counsel is a woman named Dara Foss. She's good. Fast. And she'll try to reframe this as a property dispute rather than a welfare case. Because that's the ground where Caldwell's claim is strongest. I kept her voice low and direct. Away. We'll keep it narrow: injunction ownership, procedural validity. Don't let anything Caldwell's side says pull you into defending yourself on the licensing complaint. That's a separate proceeding. I know. I'm saying it anyway, because courtrooms have a way of making people respond to things they shouldn't. As Ward stood beside her during the walk upstairs, in the way that a man stands beside someone when he is not escorting them, but simply choosing to occupy the same space, which was a different thing. She appreciated it more than she would have been comfortable saying. Caldwell was already seated when they entered the courtroom. His full team, 3 attorneys at the respondents' table, 2 assistants, a man she identified as Farrar from the photograph she'd found online, mid-60s, silver-haired, the residual bearing of a military career, worn loosely now on a civilian frame, seated 2 rows behind Caldwell, with the careful stillness of a person who knew they were being watched. She did not look at him. For long, Holloway entered at 2:1, and the room came to order in the specific organized way that federal proceedings do, not theater, not performance, just the compressed efficiency of a system in operation. She was in her mid-50s, economical with her words in the written record, and apparently economical in person as well. She reviewed the motions on record, confirmed the parties, and began. The first 40 minutes were procedural. Foss argued her case with the precise intelligence of a lawyer who had worked this jurisdiction and knew exactly where the lines were, framing Ranger's status as ambiguous, questioning the oral disclosure's validity, pushing toward the narrow reading that made the auction transfer look irregular. She was good at it. Maya sat at the petitioner's table beside Jasper and watched her and did not underestimate her. Jasper argued back with the auction company's own terms. The completed transfer timeline Ward's formal documentation. Away. Asked questions that were sharper than the attorney's arguments, cutting directly to the factual gaps she was interested in. 5. Then Priya's office presented the Yoon statement. The courtroom quality changed when the excerpts were read into the record. Dramatically. No gasps, no visible reactions from Caldwell's table, but there was a specific stillness that settled over the room. When certain sentences were read aloud, the ones that were not ambiguous, ones that documented Caldwell's explicit instruction to reclassify welfare complaints without review. Holloway made one note on her legal pad and didn't look up while she made it. When the supplemental filing naming Farr was entered, Dara Foss objected on relevance grounds. Holloway said overruled and moved on before the word had finished settling. The hearing ran 90 minutes. At the end of it, Holloway did not deliberate. She issued a ruling from the bench which was its own kind of statement. Athens. Emergency injunction was denied. The ownership transfer from Iron Ridge Tactical to Maya Whitmore was confirmed as procedurally valid and legally final. Any further challenge to its validity, Holloway noted for the record, Athens would require a showing of fraud or material misrepresentation, neither of which had been established. The oral third-party disclosure she found fell within the auction company's own terms and was witnessed by sufficient attendees to constitute valid notice. She also noted in 4 sentences that were not strictly required for the injunction ruling, but which she delivered in the same level voice as the rest, that the supplemental filing regarding administrative conduct within the military working dog transition pipeline had been referred to the federal investigation already in progress, and that any parties identified in that filing should expect contact from that investigation in the ordinary course of its work. She looked up from the bench when she said it. Farr in the second row was looking at the table in front of him. Caldwell was not. He was looking at Maya, and the expression on his face was something she hadn't seen from him before, not the amusement of the auction, not the calculated fury of the past week. It was the expression of a man who had run a plan and watched it fail in a room he couldn't control, and who was recalculating with the particular cold efficiency of someone who hadn't been in this position before, but was capable of finding a new position from it. She met his eyes for a moment, then she turned away. Outside. The courthouse on the steps in the gray November air. Ward stood beside her, while Jasper called his office and Priya spoke to a colleague at the far end of the landing. The city of Kessler moved below them with no awareness of what had just happened in the 4th-floor courtroom. The ordinary Friday afternoon traffic of a mid-sized coastal city that had its own concerns entirely. Not finished. Ward said he wasn't looking at her, looking at the street. The federal investigation moves slowly. Will lawyer up by end of business today, and the documentation case will take months to build fully. Caldwell's contracts are suspended, not terminated. The dogs, she said, the 3 he has welfare review team is on site at all 3 facilities. Today Ward turned to look at her. That was the part Priya moved on this morning. Whatever happens with the legal case, those animals get out of those facilities before the weekend. I exhaled one breath slow. Wasn't the whole answer, and she knew it wasn't the whole answer. But it was a real answer, a concrete one. And in the work she did, in the world she operated in, concrete and real was what you built from. What happens to Farrar? The investigation will determine that. What I can tell you is that he spent 2 years abusing a position of trust that existed specifically to protect these animals and their families. Ward's voice was even but not neutral. He knew exactly what he was doing. That's not going to disappear into a procedural outcome. She nodded. She was not satisfied in the way that the word satisfied implied completion. Nothing felt complete, and she was too practical to mistake a court ruling for resolution. But she was no longer fighting from a position of pure defense, and that mattered. Came back from the far end of the landing. The licensing board complaint, she said. Caldwell's filing contains several factual claims that the supplemental brief directly contradicts. I've notified the board of the contradiction. They'll review it in conjunction with the federal filing. 60 to 90 days for a full review. They can issue a preliminary finding much sooner that the complaint's evidentiary basis is disputed. She paused. I can't promise the outcome. I can tell you that a complaint filed in the same window as a federal investigation into the complainant tends to be viewed with appropriate skepticism. She thanked Priya. She thanked Ward, who accepted it with the brevity of someone who had operated in his career mostly without thanks and had not built a need for it. On the drive back to Porterfield, She called Lena. It held. Maya said injunction denied, transfer confirmed. Ina was quiet for a second. Then good just that. Anna didn't perform emotion she didn't have, which was one of her best qualities. You coming in Sunday night, I'll see you then. She called her mother next shorter conversation. The same facts delivered with the same plainness she'd used with Lena because Eleanor Whitmore had raised her on straight information, and neither of them had found a reason to change that pattern. Eleanor said, "Come up soon, bring the dog, I will," Maya said. The road back was the same two-lane coast highway she'd been driving her whole life, the scrub giving way to saltgrass as she approached Porterfield. First glimpse of the harbor coming through the low hills, in the last light of the afternoon, still and gray, and hers in the specific way that a place is yours, not because you own it, but because your attention has formed itself around it over years of looking. She got home at 5:30. Deb Foss was in the yard next door with Ranger, the two of them moving through a loose, unhurried perimeter that Ranger appeared to have initiated, and Deb appeared content to follow her car and stopped walking. She got out. He came across the yard at a measured trot, not running, not the performance of relief, just closing the distance between them with the deliberate efficiency of a dog who had decided she was part of the operational picture. Stopped at her left side. "Sat good," she said. She went inside with him and made dinner for both of them, and the house was quiet in the way it had started being quiet around him, less empty, contained. A different kind of quiet than the one she'd been living in for 3 years. Athens. She was washing the dishes when her phone buzzed a number she didn't recognize. Not Caldwell's previous number. Different area code. Different exchange, but the text that came through had a particular quality that she recognized. "Hi. I want you to understand something. What happened to is a temporary setback. You have a dog and a court ruling. I have resources and time. Like you don't win permanently against people like me. Nice. Consider this a professional courtesy." She read it twice. She took a screenshot and forwarded it to Priya and Ward simultaneously. Then she typed her response, one sentence, and sent it before she thought too hard about it. "You should talk to your attorneys before you send messages like this. I'll tell you why." She put the phone on the counter face down. Then she picked it back up because a second message had already arrived, and this one was not from Caldwell's number or any unknown number. It was from Ward, and it had come in at almost the same moment as the screenshot she'd sent him, which meant he'd sent it before he'd seen her forward. "We have a problem." Farrer didn't go to his attorneys. He went to the base. He's accessed Ranger's original service file through a legacy clearance that should have been revoked at retirement and wasn't. We don't know what he's done with it yet, but the access was logged 30 minutes ago. She stood at the kitchen counter. Ranger was behind her, and she could feel him without turning, the specific presence of a dog who had been sleeping and was now awake, now sitting, now listening to her stillness, the way he always listened to the change in her eyes. She turned around. He was looking at her with his amber eyes and his white-patched face and his scarred ears, sitting in the middle of her kitchen 6/17 on a Friday evening, as if he had always lived here, as if the distance between a combat deployment and a rental house near the harbor was something you simply crossed and then lived on the other side of it. She looked at Ward's message again. "We don't know what he's done with it yet." That was the part she couldn't calculate. Because Farrer's access to Ranger's service file could mean documentation retrieval building a defense, or it could mean something else entirely, something she hadn't mapped yet. Angle she'd missed in the architecture of everything that had happened over the past 2 weeks. She called Ward back. He answered in one ring. "What's in the file that he could use?" she said. Was quiet for exactly 3 seconds, which was the longest she'd heard him go quiet, and in those 3 seconds she understood that the answer was not simple. "There's a section of Ranger's service record," Ward said carefully, "that documents his last operational deployment in detail, including the mission that killed your father." He paused. "And including a formal incident report filed 4 days after Daniel's death, filed by Dennis Farrar, that characterized the IED event as potentially resulting from a failure in Daniel's own operational security assessment." The kitchen was very quiet. "He blamed my father," Maya said. "I've filed a report that introduced that as a possibility." The report was reviewed and the characterization was not sustained. There was no evidence to support it, and 3 other operators filed counterstatements. But it's in the file. Ward's voice was as careful as she'd ever heard it. "If Farr pulls that report and finds a way to introduce it into the federal investigation proceedings as context for his own conduct, as evidence that Daniel Whitmore was already under scrutiny and that his handler assignment was processed differently for legitimate reasons. He's building a defense out of my father's record," she said. He's going to try. She stood in the kitchen with her hand flat on the counter and the harbor dark outside the window and Ranger watching her from the middle of the floor. And she felt something move through her that was not grief and not anger, but the specific cold clarity that arrived when a situation had finally shown her its true shape. She said. The three operators who filed counterstatements. Are they findable? A pause. Two of them, one was killed in a later deployment. Can you reach them before Monday? I can reach them tonight. Fine. Then do that. She picked up her pen, and I need everything my father filed about Farrar before his last deployment. Off the formal objection. Anything else, whatever's in his records. Of his records. I have his personal records, ones he kept at home. I've been going through them for 8 months. She looked at the notebook on the table, the one she'd been adding to since the night after the auction. I think I have more than I realized. Ward was quiet for a moment. And you may have just changed the shape of this. Maybe, she said, or Farrar has, we'll find out. She hung up and opened the notebook and turned to a fresh page and started writing, and Ranger lay down at her feet under the table and put his head on his paws and breathed slowly in and out, steady as the tide. She wrote for 2 hours. She stopped once to refill her water, and once when Ranger stood and stretched and needed to go out briefly, and she led him into the yard and stood in the cold night air while he ran the fence line, watching his dark shape move through the dark yard, precise and tireless, still working. At 9:30, she found it. The third storage box of her father's personal papers. Behind a manila envelope of medical certification records and a folded topographic map, she'd never been able to identify the location of. There was a second letter, longer than the first, dated 6 weeks before his final deployment. It was addressed to Ward. It had never been sent, and in it, Daniel Whitmore described not just the formal objection from the training exercise, but a specific incident 3 months before his death in which Farrar had attempted to influence the assignment of a K9 unit for personal reasons unrelated to operational need. And Daniel had documented it in writing, and Farrar had been aware he'd done so. If anything happens to me, the letter said in the last paragraph, and it might because this work carries what it carries, I want someone to know this man is not who the system believes him to be. I'm not afraid of him. I just want it on record, somewhere outside the system he operates in. She sat at the kitchen table with the letter in her hands and the house very quiet around her, and she read it twice. And on the second reading, she understood what her father had done. He had written a letter to the one person he trusted with it, and he had never sent it because something had happened before he could, and the letter had waited in a storage box in his study for 3 years for someone to find it. She had found it, she photographed every page and sent them to Ward without a message. 40 seconds later, her phone rang. Maya. Ward's voice was unlike anything she'd heard from him before, not shaken, but weighted in a way that told her he was holding something he hadn't expected. Do you understand what this is? I understand what it is, she said. This changes everything. This isn't just evidence for the federal case. This is, he started again. This is your father testifying. She put the original letter on the table in front of her and smoothed its edges with her palm, the way you handle something fragile that has turned out to be strong. I know, she said. And outside, beyond the window, the harbor moved the way it had always moved, dark and constant and indifferent to everything, except the pull of the tide, which had never once in its entire history failed to come in when it was supposed to. Ward didn't sleep that night either, which she could tell from the timestamp on his reply. 2:47 a.m., 3 words, I have them. The two operators who'd filed counterstatements after Farrar's incident report. He'd reached them both before midnight. She didn't ask how. She understood that Ward had spent 30 years building a network of people who answered calls at midnight and didn't require explanation before deciding whether to help off. And she understood that this network existed because he had been the kind of officer who showed up for people in the same way, and that this was not a favor economy so much as a human one, the long accumulation of being trustworthy in moments that required it. She slept 4 hours. She woke at coffee and sat at the kitchen table with her father's letter flat on the surface in front of her. The original life. And she read it one more time in the early light with Ranger asleep under the table and the harbor beginning its slow gray brightening outside the window. Her father's handwriting was even and small, the handwriting of a man who'd spent years writing field notes in difficult conditions and had developed a script that was efficient without being illegible. She had always liked it. It looked like impractical, clear, nothing wasted. I want it. On record somewhere outside the system he operates in. He had trusted Ward with it. He'd written it for Ward. He'd just never gotten it there. She had gotten it there. She folded the letter carefully and put it back in its envelope, and held the envelope for a moment with both hands, not because she needed to, just because she wanted the weight of it for a second, before she set it down and moved forward, which was the only direction available. The federal investigation moved faster than Priya had originally estimated, which Priya later attributed with the careful precisions of someone who measured claims against evidence to the combination of Marcus Yoon's sworn statement, documentary evidence from Caldwell's internal communications, and Daniel Whitmore's unsent letter, which a federal attorney described in a briefing document as contemporaneous first-hand testimony from a deceased witness whose credibility is established by subsequent events. The investigation also moved faster because of the two operators Ward had reached. Their names were Thomas Bridle and Anwar Osi, and they had filed their counterstatements 3 years ago in a process that had gone nowhere, filed into an institutional channel controlled partly by the man they were challenging, and had spent 3 years assuming that was where it ended. When Ward called, both of them said yes before he'd finished explaining why he was asking. They gave formal statements to the federal team on Saturday. Both statements corroborated Daniel Whitmore's account of Farrar's conduct, added detail about the training incident that Farrar's original filing had characterized selectively, and described the specific way Farrar had responded to Daniel's formal objection, not through process but through the quiet administrative leverage of a man who controlled paperwork and understood that paperwork managed correctly could accomplish what direct confrontation could not. Farrar had not counted on Daniel leaving a record outside the system. He had also not counted on the system eventually having people in it who were looking at his record specifically. On Monday morning, 6 days after the Friday hearing, Farrar's legacy clearance was formally revoked, and his access log was pulled for full review. Unauthorized access to Ranger's service file on Friday evening was documented as a potential violation of his separation agreement, which prohibited access to active records for purposes unrelated to his official duties. He no longer had. On Monday afternoon, Farrar's attorney had been in contact with Priya's office. By Tuesday morning, there was a conversation happening that Priya described to Maya in a phone call with characteristic economy. He's considering his options, which means he's calculating what cooperation is worth compared to what exposure costs. Is it going to be enough? More of the investigation. He's one piece, an important one, but one piece for Caldwell. A pause. Caldwell's exposure doesn't depend on Farrar's cooperation. The Yoon documentation is sufficient. Farrar helps us understand the pipeline's architecture. The pipeline being criminal doesn't require Farrar to confess to it. She was in the break room at Seaside General when she took the call 10 minutes into a lunch break she'd been putting off since noon. She ate her sandwich while Priya talked and felt the specific grounded satisfaction of a person doing two ordinary things at once, which was itself a kind of evidence that the world had not entirely reorganized itself around the crisis. One more thing, Priya said before hanging up. The licensing board received our supplemental notification Friday afternoon. They've opened a review of the complaint's evidentiary basis. Expect a preliminary finding within the next 2 weeks that the complaint was filed without adequate factual support. Which means the complaint doesn't go forward. It doesn't mean it disappears from the record. A complaint that's reviewed and dismissed is still a complaint that was filed. But your licensing record will show the outcome, not just the filing a beat. For what it's worth, I think Caldwell miscalculated on that one. Filing against your license made this personal in a way that motivated more thorough investigation than he would have preferred. She thought about that. After she hung up, there was something in it that she wanted to examine from different angles. The idea that Caldwell's instinct to reach for the most personal weapon available had been in the end a strategic mistake, because it had converted what might have remained a narrow legal dispute into something that attracted the kind of institutional attention that thorough cases required. She'd spent 3 weeks being the target of that instinct. She was not glad it had happened. She was clear-eyed about what it had cost her in sleep and fear, and the specific exhaustion of fighting on multiple fronts while maintaining a full professional life. But she also understood that Caldwell had looked at her and seen someone small enough to intimidate, and that his read of her as a target had been the thing that undid him, not anything she had strategically arranged. She had simply refused to be what he'd assessed her as. The refusing had been the whole thing. 3 weeks after the hearing, the federal investigation issued its first formal action, a cease and desist order against Caldwell Defense Partners, suspending all 3 active federal contracts pending full review, 5. With a public notice that the suspension related to alleged misuse of federal military resources and systemic welfare violations involving retired military working animals. 5. The notice was 4 paragraphs. It ran in 3 news outlets, 2 of which she'd never heard of, and one of which was the same regional outlet whose alert she'd seen the night the whistleblower filing broke. It was not a major story. It was not covered nationally. 5. It was the kind of institutional action that moves through the world in press releases and legal databases and the professional networks of people who track such things, and for everyone else it is invisible. For the men and women who had served beside the dogs in those files, it was not invisible. She found out about the reach of it, gradually the way you find out about things that travel through networks you didn't know you were part of. Message through word from a former K9 handler in another state who had been trying to locate his dog for 8 months. Call from a woman in a different city whose husband had served with a German Shepherd now listed as unlocatable in the pipeline records. 5. A post in a veterans online community that Ward sent her a link to in which someone described what had happened at the Iron Ridge auction in enough accurate detail that she knew it had been told person to person, passed along through a specific chain of people who understood exactly what it meant. 5. She read that post on a Tuesday evening sitting at the kitchen table with Ranger at her feet, and she sat with it for a long time without responding because there was nothing to add that the telling of it hadn't already done. Called her the following Friday, not a text this time, a call, which by now she understood as his way of marking that something required a voice. Caldwell's attorneys reached out to the federal team this morning, he said. He's entering into a negotiated resolution process. Which means his attorneys have calculated that the evidentiary case against him is strong enough that fighting it fully is more expensive than settling the terms. Ward's voice was even. He won't face criminal charges under the negotiated framework, that's the trade-off. But the 3 federal contracts are terminated permanently, not just suspended. He's required to pay restitution into a fund established for the welfare and proper placement of retired military working dogs. And he's barred from any future contracts involving federal military assets or personnel. Quiet for a moment, that's not prison. No, Ward said. And he didn't soften it or explain it away, it's not. The criminal threshold for what he did involves intent elements that are difficult to establish beyond reasonable doubt when his defense is that he relied on Farr's administrative representations. It's not a satisfying answer, it's the honest one. She sat with that she had known since Priya's first phone call that the law moved in channels she didn't control and produced outcomes that were not calibrated to what felt just. The dogs had been used as equipment. The families hadn't been notified. Her father's record had been manipulated by a man who resented him. Of that would be fully accounted for by a negotiated resolution and a fine paid into a fund. The fund was real. The termination was permanent. The public record would carry the outcome of the federal action, which was a different thing from nothing, she said. Farr cooperated fully in exchange for reduced exposure on the unauthorized records access charge. Operations means the investigation has a complete picture of the pipeline's operation. Over the 2 years he managed it, a pause. He's been referred to the relevant military review board for potential action against his retirement benefits. That process is separate and slower. Will it produce anything? I don't know, Ward said, and she appreciated that he didn't dress the uncertainty up as something else. The review board has discretion. I'll be submitting your father's letter as part of the evidentiary record for that process. Edel and OC have agreed to submit additional statements. What will they do with it? I genuinely don't know. What I know is that the record will contain it. The record will say that a man wrote down the truth about what he'd seen and that it mattered even 3 years after he was gone. He was quiet for a second. It's not nothing, Maya. No, she said, it's not. She looked at Ranger. He was lying with his chin on the floor, amber eyes half closed in the particular drowsy alertness of a dog at rest, who is nevertheless tracking the room. And she thought about the distance between the Iron Ridge warehouse and this kitchen. Not in miles, not in time, but in the series of things that had to be true simultaneously for this moment to exist. Her father writing a letter he never sent. Existing in a network that answered calls. Marcus Yukon, deciding that watching a dead soldier's dog be used as disposable equipment was the line he couldn't cross. Magistrate who'd seen the playbook before and was not interested in seeing it again. None of it had been clean. None of it had been a straight line from wrong to right. It had been the slow, grinding, imperfect work of people using the tools available to them in the direction of something that mattered, and some of those people would never know each other. And some of the outcomes were less than they should have been, and the costs had been distributed unevenly, and none of that changed the fact that it had moved. 5. She drove to her mother's house on a Saturday in December, 5 weeks after the hearing. She took the coast road north, which added 40 minutes to the trip and was worth it for the view, the ocean flat and pewter-colored under the winter sky, the dunes low and brown, the occasional lighthouse, catching the weak December light on its white surface and holding it briefly before the clouds moved. Ranger rode in the back with the window cracked 2 inches, his nose working the salt air in long, slow pulls. Eleanor Whitmore came out to the front porch when she heard the gravel. She was in a heavy sweater, and her hair was gray now at the temples in a way it hadn't been 3 years ago, and she looked at Ranger when he stepped out of the back seat with the expression Maya had expected, not tearful. Eleanor did not perform the emotion she felt, but present in a way that said she was holding something significant and choosing to hold it quietly. Ranger stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at Eleanor. Eleanor came down 2 steps and crouched the way Maya had crouched at the auction, the same instinct toward level contact rather than top-down approach. She put her hand out, palm up, and waited. Ranger walked to her and put his nose in her palm and stood there for a moment breathing, and then he stepped in and leaned his shoulder against her knee, the way he had never done with Maya, the way he did with Eleanor on the first meeting, as if he had assessed something in that 30 seconds of contact and made a decision about it. Eleanor put both arms around him briefly and closed her eyes. Maya stood at the car and did not say anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. They had lunch inside, the 3 of them, in Eleanor's kitchen, with its familiar smell of coffee and the specific soap she had always used, and Ranger lay in the corner on a mat Maya had brought and watched the room with his drowsy amber attention. Eleanor asked questions in her direct, unhurried way about the hearing, about Farrar, about what happened to the other dogs, and Maya answered them the same way, both of them sitting across from each other in the language they'd always used, fact to fact, weight for weight, no sentimentality about the difficulty and no minimization of it either. He didn't send the, said Eleanor at one point, talking about Daniel, about the letter to Ward. He would have a pause. She turned her coffee mug between her hands. He was careful about when he used Ward. He didn't want to call on him for something he could handle himself. He probably thought he'd send it when he was sure it was necessary. She looked at the mug, ran out of time to be sure. Maya nodded. Letter got there anyway, Eleanor said. Did. Her mother looked up. That was you, I just found it. That's the part that needed to happen, Eleanor said simply, and looked back at her mug, and that was the end of that. After lunch, they walked along the path above the cliff, the 3 of them. The December wind coming off the water with enough force to make conversation difficult and enough cold to make the movement necessary. And Ranger ran the edge of the path ahead of them with his nose down and his tail in its working position, not high, not tucked, at horizontal. Nathan's reading, and Eleanor watched him and said, over the wind. It still works. Always will, Maya said. It's not something he turns off. Like your father. She thought about that. Dad turned it off at home. He was good at it, Eleanor said. It didn't come naturally. She watched Ranger make a turn at the cliff edge and come back toward them at a trot. I think that's true for most people who do hard things. They practice the parts that don't come naturally. Hard parts easy from the outside, because the practice is invisible. Maya walked beside her mother in the wind and didn't answer, because it was true and complete in itself, and adding to it would only thin it. January came cold and clear, and with it the formal outcomes that the preceding weeks had been building toward. The licensing board issued its preliminary finding on the 8th. The Caldwell complaint was dismissed for insufficient evidentiary basis, with a notation that the complaint appeared to have been filed as a collateral action in ongoing litigation rather than based on independent evidence of professional misconduct. The notation would remain in the record. The complaint would not proceed. Vasquez sent her a 1-line email, saw the board notification. Good, see you Thursday. Not because she needed a physical copy, but because she wanted to hold it for a second, and then file it in the same folder as the original licensing board inquiry letter, so that the document that had opened the proceeding and the document that had closed it were in the same place. Record of the full shape of it, beginning and end. The federal investigation's pulp summary was released on the 14th, a Tuesday, and it named Caldwell Defense Partners by name, described the acquisition pipeline in specific terms, and listed the welfare violations documented across the 3 facilities. Named Marcus Yoon as the primary whistleblower and included a statement from the investigative office that his testimony had been essential to establishing the systemic nature of the conduct. Is it also included in a subsection that she read 3 times, a brief description of the role played by a private individual who filed formal welfare requests that were systematically suppressed subsequently, identified the suppression pattern through independent research, and presented contemporaneous documentary evidence that substantially advanced the investigation's scope. Just the description Ward called her the morning. The summary dropped. Have you seen it? I saw it, the language in the 3rd subsection. I read it. The investigative office asked my permission to include it before publishing, he said. I told them. The decision was yours. They said they'd leave the identification anonymous either way. I know. She was sitting at the kitchen table. Ranger was at the back door watching a sparrow on the fence through the glass with the focused patience of a dog who has no intention of doing anything about it but finds it worth tracking. Nonetheless, anonymous is fine. Are you sure she thought about it? She genuinely thought about it because Ward was asking because it mattered, and it deserved a real answer rather than a reflexive one. The point was never for anyone to know what I did. The point was to get Ranger home and to make sure what Caldwell was doing to those dogs stopped. She paused. Both of those things happened. The acknowledgement is less important than the outcome. That's a very disciplined way to feel about it. I didn't say it was easy, she said. I said it was accurate. He was quiet for a moment. Then, your father said something similar once, after an operation that went exactly right and for which his unit received no official recognition. He said the operation going right was the recognition. She sat with that for a moment. He was a remarkable person, Ward said. It was said without performance, just the direct statement of a man who had known a lot of people and was not casual about that particular word. I want you to know that I've been thinking about him a great deal over the past 2 months. About what it cost him to do what he did in that valley, and about the fact that he kept doing it afterward, kept showing up, kept serving with some standard. He was the kind of person who makes the institutions he serves in better than they would have been without him. Those people are rarer than the institutions generally deserve. She didn't trust her voice for a second. Thank you, she said when she did. I should have found you sooner, he said when Ranger was cycled out. I should have found you before you had to find us. You found me when it counted. That's a generous read. It's an accurate one. Same word she'd used a minute ago. She meant it the same way. The 3 dogs from Caldwell's facilities were placed by the end of January. 2 went to certified handler families through the proper notification process that should have been followed from the beginning. The German Shepherd, whose welfare complaint had been buried and reclassified, required an additional 6 weeks of rehabilitative work before placement. The behavioral deterioration had been real, and it had consequences that the paperwork could identify but couldn't undo. He was placed in February with a retired military K9 trainer in a rural county 3 states away, a man named Gil Rourke, who had spent 12 years working military dogs, and who said when Ward described the case to him, "Send him to me. I've got time, and I've got space, and I'm not in a hurry." Sent her a photo in March. Gil Rourke's property. Field with a creek at the far edge. Thanks. And the German Shepherd running the field's full length with his ears up and his stride open and long. Specific stride of an animal who has rediscovered that the world is large enough to move in freely. She put the photo on her phone's home screen for 3 days and then moved it to an album because she wanted to keep, but she didn't want to look at it constantly. Didn't want to let it calcify into symbol rather than remaining what it was. A dog running in a field because someone with time and patience had made that possible. February. Elias Ward submitted a formal request to the Military Review Board regarding Dennis Farrar's retirement benefits case. The submission included Daniel Whitmore's unsent letter, the statements from Bridle and O.C. Ward's own sworn account of Farrar's administrative conduct, and a summary of the federal investigation's findings as they related to Farrar's role in the pipeline. The review board process was closed, deliberate, and not public. Maya did not expect to hear its outcome quickly, and she didn't. She heard it in April in a call from Ward at 7:20 in the morning while she was getting ready for a day shift. Upward ruled, he said. Farrar's retirement benefits are reduced by 40%, and a formal reprimand is entered into his permanent service record. A pause. Reprimand specifically cites the incident report he filed regarding your father and characterizes it as professionally motivated misrepresentation in a document intended for the official record. That language will remain in his service file permanently. She stood in her bathroom with her ID badge in her hand and looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. Not the most the board could do, she asked for a retired officer without criminal conviction. Yes. Within those parameters, it's significant because of the specific language. Because of the specific language he confirmed. The official record now states that what he wrote about your father was not true and was not filed in good faith. In the institutional context where that matters, it matters. She put the badge on, I'm going to be late for my shift if I don't leave in 4 minutes. Go, a brief pause. Daniel would have done exactly the same thing. Come to work. I know, she said. That's where I learned it. Came late to Porterfield that year, the way it sometimes did when the ocean took its time warming cold through March, a cautious April. And then a week in the first days of May where the light shifted and the harbor turned from gray to green blue and the salt grass came up fast and the town remerged from its winter interior. She ran the coast path in the mornings now, 3 miles out and back, and Ranger ran it with her, not because she'd trained him to run with her, but because she'd started running and he'd started coming along and it had become the shape of the morning. The way things become the shape of a day when 2 people, or a person and a dog, agree without discussion on a routine. He was different in the ways that mattered, still watchful. That was not something that would change. It was in him too deep to unlearn, and she had stopped wanting it to be different. But the watchfulness had changed quality in the auction warehouse. It had been the vigilance of an animal who had decided the world was uniformly dangerous. On the coast path in the May morning light, it was the attention of a working animal in a space he had assessed and found safe, choosing to run his nose along the tidal edge of the world because it was interesting and because he could. She had not stopped thinking about her father. She did not expect to. But the shape of thinking about him had changed, less raw, less unfinished, the grief settling from acute into something chronic and manageable, which was the trajectory grief took for most people when it took it at all, which was not always. She had patients who lost people and never settled, and she knew that the settling was not automatic and not earned, and she didn't take it for granted. She had. She thought was the letter not the original. She'd submitted that to the federal record and had kept the photographs. But she had the knowledge that her father had named the truth before he died, had written it down, had trusted it to paper in a world where paper could be lost or buried or ignored, and had been right that it would matter eventually. She thought about that when she ran. Strategically, not philosophically. Just when she was 2 miles out on the path with the ocean light and Ranger ranging ahead, and the specific clean emptiness of early morning, she thought about her father writing that letter, careful and even in a world that was trying to teach him the truth didn't travel well. It had traveled not easily, not on time, but it had gotten where it was meant to go. It came to Porterfield in late May. He drove himself, arrived in the early afternoon, and knocked on her back door, because the front gate was latched and Ranger was in the yard, and he'd been around enough working dogs to know that you didn't reach over a latched gate on a working dog's property without announcing yourself first. She made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table, which by now she had sat at through enough consequential hours that it felt like the table where things got decided, though of course it was just a table, Pipeline Reform Ward said. The formal proposal went to committee last week. It mandates written family notification for all handler history dogs within 30 days of retirement processing, with a documented response requirement before any auction or secondary placement is authorized. But pass. It will pass. It has enough support now from people who understand what happened and don't want to repeat it. He wrapped his hands around the mug. It's being called the Whitmore-Ossie Protocol in the internal drafts, after your father and Anwar, who was the first to file a counterstatement that challenged Farrar's report. She looked at the table for a moment. My father would have been uncomfortable with that. Probably Ward almost smiled. We're naming it after him anyway. She didn't argue. He left in the early evening, and she stood on the back step and watched his car down the gravel lane, and Ranger stood beside her, and the harbor was turning gold in the late light, that specific May evening color that only happened for about 10 minutes and that she'd been watching since childhood. She put her hand on the back of Ranger's neck. He leaned into it slightly. It was as much as he did. Okay, she said, on word voice. First word she'd said to him in the parking lot at Iron Ridge. First word she'd said to herself alone in her car at 6 a.m. before she drove 4 hours to a warehouse full of people who didn't see her coming. She had learned that about herself in the process of all this. She was the kind of person who said okay and meant it as a decision rather than a surrender. She said it when she was not sure everything was okay, when the situation was difficult, and the outcome was uncertain, and the path forward was longer than she wanted it to be. She said it because the alternative to saying it was stopping, and she had never found stopping to be something she could sustain for long. She went inside and fed Ranger his dinner and made herself a meal that was more careful than what she usually managed on an ordinary evening, something that required actual preparation, because it was a good evening and she wanted to mark it as one. She ate at the kitchen table with the back door cracked, so the harbor air came through and Ranger lay at her feet, and the house had the particular settled quality that she had not known it was possible to rebuild from scratch, but apparently there was a version of this story that she could have told in a way that made her the center of it. The young woman who walked into a room of powerful men and refused to be dismissed, who fought for her father's legacy and won. That version was not wrong, exactly. But it was not accurate, which was different. The more accurate version was that many people had made many choices in the right direction over months and years, and that she had been one of them, and that the combination of all those choices had produced something none of them could have produced alone. Marcus Ewan, deciding he'd seen enough Thomas Bridle and Anwar Osi, filing counterstatements into a process they thought had buried them. S. Ward, picking up the phone at midnight, her father writing a letter he never sent. Sathian expediting a welfare review at the right moment. And Ranger walking toward her on the auction platform when every behavioral assessment said he had stopped walking toward anyone. Whatever. That had been recognition instinct, the deep-channeled memory of a working animal who had learned to read people past the surface. It had been the thing that changed the room. Without it, she could have spoken her father's name, and it would have been a name. With it, the room understood that the name was also a living claim that hadn't been properly honored. She thought about that sometimes, about what Ranger had done choosing her. About whether he'd known something, or whether it was simpler and stranger than knowing just the fact of her, carrying the specific combination of voice and posture and scent that his years with Daniel had made familiar, tying up a recognition, so old it lived below decision. She would never know she was comfortable with that. Some things in her professional life and in her personal one required that she act without full information, and she had made her peace with being a person who could do that without pretending the uncertainty didn't exist. What she knew was this: he was here, and she was here. And the harbor was outside the window, and her father had written the truth down before he ran out of time, and the truth had gotten where it was meant to go. And some people who should have been held accountable had been held accountable. Imperfectly, incompletely, in the way that accountability almost always operated in the real world, which was not nothing, and was not everything, and was what there was to build from. And she was building. That summer, she began attending a monthly meeting of a veteran K9 handler support network that Ward had connected her to, not as a handler herself, but as a nurse who understood both the medical and the institutional sides of the transition process, and who was willing to help families navigate the pipeline that was being reformed slowly, imperfectly, with the friction that all institutional reform produced. She was not the youngest person in those rooms, but she was sometimes the only woman, and she was never the most decorated, and she was not there to be any of those things. She was there because she knew what it cost to file 3 requests that went nowhere, and because she believed that one person in the room who had done that and come out the other side could make it easier for the next person to keep going. She told them in those rooms. She told them plainly. It takes longer than it should. The channels are slower than the need. The system has people in it who use it badly and people in it who use it well, and you cannot always tell which is which from the outside. You go in anyway. You document everything. You find the people who will answer calls at midnight. You hold on to the letter even when there's no address to send it to, because addresses have a way of appearing eventually. You say okay, and you mean it as a decision, not a surrender. And you keep moving forward, because forward is where the people you're trying to reach are, and they are worth reaching. Ranger came with her to those meetings. He lay under the chairs and worked the room with his nose and let the people who needed to touch something steady put their hands on his back. And he tolerated it with the dignified patience of an animal who had decided that this particular use of his body was acceptable, even if it was not the work he'd been trained for. She thought, watching him one evening in the community center room where the meeting was held, its own kind of service, of a different theater. The same essential thing, a living body between a person and the worst version of what they feared, saying without words, I'm still here. You're still here, that counts for something. She drove home that night with him in the back, and the summer air coming through the windows and the coastal highway dark except for her headlights and the occasional light of a house set back from the road. And she thought about her father, and she thought about the path forward, and she thought about all the names she didn't know, the family still looking, dogs still in wrong places, The paperwork still buried in the wrong offices, and she felt the weight of it. Because the weight was real, and refusing to feel it would have been its own kind of dishonesty. And then she crossed into Porterfield on the coast road and saw the harbor lights on the water familiar as her own hands, and she exhaled. And Ranger shifted in the back and put his nose against the cracked window and breathed the salt air in long and slow. She pulled into the gravel lane. She cut the engine. The harbor moved in the dark the way it had always moved. She got out and opened the back door, and Ranger stepped down and walked to the gate of the yard and waited for her, looking back once over his shoulder with those amber eyes to confirm she was coming. She was coming. She unlatched the gate. They went in.